What would you do if you caught a beautiful woman stealing military secrets in the middle of nowhere? Kill her, turn her in, or discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy can become the one person worth dying for? Because in 1878, when the Mexican-American border was nothing more than an imaginary line drawn in blood and broken treaties, one captured spy was about to learn that the heart doesn't recognize flags or loyalty oaths. And one mountain man was about to discover that sometimes the most beautiful lies can lead to the most honest truths. This is the story of Elena Vasquez, a woman who lived three different lives in one body. By day, she was Sarah Mitchell, a school teacher from Philadelphia seeking adventure in the frontier territories. By night, she was a ghost who slipped through military camps like smoke, photographing troop movements and copying classified documents. But in the hands of Jacob Bear Morrison, she was about to become something she'd never been before, completely helpless. The rope burns on her wrists weren't just marks from being captured. They were proof that she'd fought like hell when Jacob had cornered her outside Fort Davidson, clutching a leather satchel full of stolen intelligence that could shift the balance of power across three states. She'd kicked, bit, and cursed in two languages, but Jacob Morrison hadn't survived 4 years of mountain wilderness by being gentle with dangerous prey. Now sitting in his remote cabin with her hands bound behind her back, Elena stared across a wooden table at the man who held her fate in his weathered hands. The lantern light flickered between them, casting shadows that danced like the lies she'd been telling for months. His blue eyes, sharp as winter frost, studied her face with the patience of a predator who knew his quarry had nowhere to run. So, Jacob's voice was low, measured, with the kind of calm that came from men who'd seen too much death to be rattled by much of anything. You gonna tell me who you really are? Or do I have to start guessing? Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. 3 months of playing Sarah Mitchell had taught her how to lie with her eyes as easily as her voice. I already told you, Mr. Morrison. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a school teacher from Philadelphia. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Yeah, you mentioned that. Funny thing about Philadelphia teachers, though. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, placing it on the table between them. They don't usually carry forged travel documents. The blood drained from Elena's face as she recognized her own handiwork. She'd been so careful, so meticulous in crafting Sarah Mitchell's identity. But here, in this isolated cabin with this mountain man who seemed to see through every layer of deception she'd built, all her careful planning felt as fragile as morning frost. But that morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, neither Elena nor Jacob could have known that this interrogation would become something neither of them expected. Because sometimes the most dangerous missions aren't the ones that might get you killed. They're the ones that might teach you how to live. Jacob Morrison had been tracking her for 3 days. Not because he'd wanted to, mind you. The mountain man preferred his solitude, preferred the company of pine trees and hunting rifles to the complications that came with other human beings. But when you stumble across a woman photographing military supply routes at 2 in the morning, well, some complications just can't be ignored. He'd first spotted her outside Fort Davidson on a Tuesday night, crouched behind a supply wagon with what looked like one of those fancy new cameras the government boys had been using during the war. At first, he'd figured her for a journalist. Lord knew there were enough of them sniffing around the territories these days, looking for stories about Indian raids and railroad expansion. But journalists didn't usually work in the dead of night, and they sure as hell didn't carry the kind of forged papers he'd found in her saddlebags. The chase had taken them through some of the roughest country in Colorado territory. Elena, though he didn't know her real name yet, had proven herself to be one hell of a rider. She'd led him through box canyons that would have broken a lesser horse's legs, across creek beds swollen with snowmelt, and up mountain passes where the air was so thin it made your lungs burn. But Jacob had spent the better part of 10 years in these mountains, and he knew every deer trail, every hidden spring, every cave that could shelter a man from the wind. She'd made her mistake at Eagle's Rest, a narrow outcropping about 15 miles southeast of his cabin. It was good defensive ground. You could see anyone coming from miles away, but it was also a trap. Only one way up, only one way down. She'd probably figured she could wait him out, maybe slip away in the darkness. She'd figured wrong. Jacob had come up the back way through a series of handholds that would have challenged a mountain goat. He'd taken his time, moving silent as smoke, until he was close enough to hear her breathing. She'd been reloading her rifle when he'd pressed the barrel of his own gun against the back of her neck. "Don't," he'd said quietly. To her credit, she hadn't screamed or begged. She'd gone very still, her hands frozen on the rifle's mechanism, and said in a voice steady as stone, "What do you want?" Answers. That had been yesterday morning. The ride back to his cabin had been tense but uneventful. She'd sat straight-backed in her saddle, hands tied to the horn, never once asking where he was taking her or what he planned to do with her. Most folks would have been pleading for their lives by then, or at least trying to negotiate. But this woman, this Sarah Mitchell, if that was really her name, she'd ridden like she was heading to a church social instead of what might well be her own execution. Now sitting across from her in his cabin, Jacob found himself genuinely curious about what made her tick. He'd interrogated enough men during the war to know the signs. The darting eyes of someone looking for an escape route, the nervous fidgeting of hands that wished they had a weapon, the way a person's voice changed when they were trying to sell you a story they didn't quite believe themselves. But Elena showed none of those tells. She sat perfectly still, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching, her voice calm and measured when she spoke. If he hadn't caught her red-handed with a satchel full of stolen intelligence, he might have actually believed she was exactly who she claimed to be. "Let's try this again," Jacob said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He didn't offer her any, partly because her hands were still tied, and partly because he wasn't feeling particularly hospitable toward spies. "What's a school teacher from Philadelphia doing with photographs of military supply routes?" Elena tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question from a new angle. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Morrison. Those photographs are of local landmarks. I'm documenting the natural beauty of the frontier for a series of articles I plan to publish back east." It was a good lie, Jacob had to give her that. Smooth delivery, reasonable explanation, just the right amount of indignation in her voice. If he hadn't seen the documents in her satchel with his own eyes, he might have bought it. "Natural beauty," he repeated, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Is that what you call ammunition depot layouts these days?" For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, something flickered behind her eyes. Fear? Calculation? Then it was gone, replaced by that same steady composure. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said. "Perhaps if you showed me these photographs you're referring to, I could explain." "No misunderstanding." Jacob set his cup down with deliberate care. "I know what I saw. Question is, who are you working for?" Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've been living alone in these mountains for some time. Perhaps the isolation has made you imaginative, but I assure you I am exactly who I say I am." Jacob almost smiled at that. She was good, better than most of the Confederate spies he dealt with during the war. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd assumed that because he lived like a hermit, he was some kind of mountain savage who could be easily fooled by a pretty face and a convincing story. "Isolation," he mused, leaning back in his chair. "Funny thing about isolation, Miss Mitchell. It teaches you to pay attention to details, like the way you hold yourself, straight-backed, alert, ready to move at a second's notice. That's not how school teachers sit. That's how soldiers sit." He saw her hands tense slightly against the ropes that bound them. "And your boots," he continued, warming to his subject. "Good leather, well made, but worn in patterns that suggest a lot of hard riding. More riding than a Philadelphia school teacher would likely do in a lifetime." Elena's breathing had changed, become more shallow. She was still maintaining her composure, but Jacob could see the cracks starting to form. "But the real giveaway," he said, reaching into his coat again, "was this." He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and placed it on the table between them. Elena's eyes fixed on it immediately, and for the first time since he'd captured her, Jacob saw genuine fear cross her face. "Found it sewn into the lining of your saddlebags," he explained. "Took me a while to figure out what it was. The writing's in some kind of code, but the numbers, those I recognize. Troop movements, supply schedules, patrol routes. Either you're the most thorough nature photographer in the history of journalism, or you're exactly what I think you are." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending a loose shutter somewhere banging against the wall. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had been holding Elena in place. "All right," she said quietly, her accent shifting subtly. Less Philadelphia, more something else. Something that carried the warm vowels of the Southwest. "You're right, I'm not Sarah Mitchell." Jacob nodded slowly. "I figured as much. So who are you, really?" Elena met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd captured her, Jacob saw something honest in her gaze. It was still guarded, still careful, but it was real. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, "and if you turn me into the authorities, you'll be signing the death warrant of every Mexican family living north of the Rio Grande." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jacob studied Elena's face, looking for any sign that this was just another layer of deception, another carefully constructed lie designed to manipulate him into letting his guard down. But what he saw in her dark eyes wasn't the calculated cunning of a practiced liar. It was the desperate honesty of someone who just played their last card. "Death warrant," he repeated slowly, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "That's a hell of a thing to say to a man who's got you tied up in his cabin." Elena's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that reminded Jacob of a cornered wildcat, dangerous even when trapped. "It's the truth, Mr. Morrison, whether you believe it or not." "I'm listening." She took a breath, and Jacob could see her making calculations behind her eyes. How much to reveal, how much to hold back, how to spin the truth in a way that might save her life without completely compromising her mission. "There are plans," she began, her voice careful and measured, "military plans being drawn up in Washington that would authorize the forcible relocation of all Mexican nationals currently living in former Mexican territories. Every family that chose to stay when the treaty was signed, every person who considered themselves American citizens under the law, they'd be rounded up like cattle and shipped south of the border." Jacob frowned. He'd heard rumors of such things, whispered conversations in trading posts and military camps, but nothing concrete. "That's a pretty serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact." Elena leaned forward as much as her bindings would allow. "I've seen the documents, Mr. Morrison. Orders already written, just waiting for the right excuse to be implemented. And that excuse is coming soon." "What kind of excuse?" Elena's jaw tightened. "A border incident. Something that can be blamed on Mexican insurgents operating in American territory. Something that will give Washington the political cover it needs to implement what they're calling the Southwestern Pacification Initiative." The name sent a chill down Jacob's spine. He'd heard that kind of language before, during the war. Bureaucrats and politicians loved their euphemisms, their clean words for dirty business. Pacification was just another way of saying extermination. "And your role in all this? To document the military preparations, troop movements, supply depots, communication networks. My government needs to know what's coming so we can prepare our people." "Your government?" Jacob leaned back, processing this new information. "So you're working for Mexico. I'm working for justice." The words came out sharper than Elena had probably intended, revealing a depth of passion that her careful composure had been hiding. "Those families you're talking about? They're not abstract political problems, Mr. Morrison. They're real people with real lives. Children who were born on American soil, grandparents who've been farming the same land for 3 generations, merchants and craftsmen, and teachers who've built communities and contributed to this country." She paused, and Jacob could see her fighting to keep her emotions in check. "My own family included," she added quietly. That stopped Jacob cold. "Your family?" Elena nodded, and for the first time since he'd captured her, Jacob saw something crack in her armor. "My parents live in San Antonio. My father is a blacksmith, was a blacksmith. The new territorial government has been making it difficult for Mexican-owned businesses to operate. My mother teaches children to read and write in both English and Spanish. Under the new regulations, that's considered promoting foreign influence." Jacob had to admit, despite everything, he was finding it hard to maintain his suspicion in the face of Elena's obvious pain. Either she was the best actress he'd ever encountered, or she was telling him the truth. And if she was telling the truth, so you decided to become a spy. I decided to do what I could to protect the people I love. Elena's voice hardened again. Wouldn't you do the same? The question hit closer to home than Jacob was comfortable with. He'd spent the last few years running from exactly that kind of responsibility, hiding in the mountains where other people's problems couldn't find him. But there had been a time when he'd worn a uniform, when he'd believed that fighting for something bigger than yourself was not only possible, but necessary. Maybe, he admitted, but that doesn't change the fact that you're a foreign agent operating on American soil. What you're doing is treason. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Treason? Against what? A government that's planning to destroy innocent families for the crime of having been born on the wrong side of an imaginary line? A country that promises liberty and justice for all, then writes secret orders to implement ethnic cleansing? You can't know that for certain. Plans get written all the time that never get implemented. I have names, Mr. Morrison, dates, specific units that have already received preliminary orders. This isn't some theoretical possibility. It's happening. And the people who need to know about it, the people who might be able to stop it, they're the ones you'll be condemning if you turn me in. Jacob stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the endless expanse of mountains and forest that had been his refuge for so long. The simple life he'd built for himself, hunting, trapping, trading for supplies a few times a year, suddenly felt inadequate in the face of the complicated moral landscape Elena was laying out before him. How do I know you're not lying? He asked without turning around. Because I'm still alive. That made him turn back to face her. What do you mean? If I was just making this up, if this was all some elaborate cover story I'd concocted to save my own skin, don't you think I would have gone with something more believable, something that didn't make me sound like a dangerous foreign operative? She had a point. If Elena had been trying to manipulate him, she probably would have stuck with the schoolteacher story, maybe added some tragic backstory about being robbed by bandits who planted evidence in her belongings. Besides, she continued, what do I have to gain by lying to you now? You've already seen the evidence. You know what I was doing. The only question is what you're going to do about it. Jacob moved back to the table and sat down heavily. The weight of the decision he was facing felt heavier than anything he'd carried in years. During the war, the choices had been simpler. Shoot or be shot, follow orders or face court-martial. But this was different. You're asking me to let a spy go free, he said. I'm asking you to let a woman trying to protect her family continue her work. Same thing. Is it? Elena leaned forward again, her eyes intense. If someone was planning to round up your family, to tear them away from everything they'd ever known, and dump them in a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on their backs, wouldn't you want someone to warn you? Jacob thought about his own family, long dead now, buried in a churchyard back in Ohio that he hadn't visited in more than a decade. But he remembered them, remembered the way his mother used to hum while she cooked dinner, the way his father's face would light up when he talked about the farm they were building together. What would he have done to protect them if he'd known what was coming? Even if I believed everything you're telling me, he said slowly, I can't just let you walk away. You've admitted to espionage against the United States military. Then don't let me walk away. Elena's words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Come with me. Jacob blinked. What? You know these mountains better than anyone. You know how to move without being seen, how to survive in country that would kill most men. And you, she paused, studying his face. You're not a man who can stand by and watch innocent people suffer, no matter how hard you try to convince yourself otherwise. You don't know anything about me. Don't I? Elena tilted her head slightly. A man who lives alone in the wilderness for years, who avoids human contact, who's built himself a fortress of solitude where no one can ask him to care about anything beyond his own survival. That sounds like someone who's running from something. And in my experience, the people who run the hardest are usually the ones who care the most. The observation hit Jacob like a physical blow. He thought he'd buried that part of himself years ago, thought he'd successfully transformed from a man who gave a damn into someone who could exist purely for his own needs and desires. But here was this woman, this spy, This enemy seeing right through the walls he'd built and exposing the truth he'd been trying so hard to escape. "I need time to think," he said finally. Elena nodded. "Of course, but while you're thinking, Mr. Morrison, remember that every day you delay is another day closer to implementation. And once those orders are carried out, no amount of regret will bring back the families that are destroyed." Jacob stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'm going to check on the horses. Don't even think about trying to escape. This cabin is 15 miles from the nearest settlement, and there are wolves in these woods that would consider you a convenient meal." He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, needing to put some distance between himself and Elena's penetrating gaze. But as he reached for the handle, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Morrison?" He paused without turning around. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for listening." Jacob stepped out into the cold mountain air without responding, but Elena's words followed him into the darkness. And for the first time in years, Jacob Morrison found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, running away wasn't the answer after all. Jacob stood in the cold night air for longer than he'd intended, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the mountain wind. The horses nickered softly in their makeshift corral, sensing his presence but not approaching. Even they knew when a man needed space to think. The problem was, thinking was the last thing Jacob wanted to do. Thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant confronting truths he'd spent the better part of a decade trying to bury. But Elena's words had opened something inside him, some locked door that he'd barricaded shut with isolation and willful ignorance. "You're not a man who can stand by and watch innocent people suffer." How could she possibly know that? How could a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours see what he'd been trying so hard to hide from himself? When the cold finally drove him back inside, Jacob found Elena exactly where he'd left her, sitting straight backed in the chair with her hands still bound behind her. But something had changed in her expression. The wariness was still there, but it was tempered now with something that looked almost like sympathy. "You served," she said quietly as he hung his coat on the peg by the door. It wasn't a question. Jacob paused, his hand still on the coat. "What makes you say that?" "The way you walk, the way you hold yourself, the way you interrogated me, patient, methodical, like someone who's done it before." Elena's voice was soft, without the edge it had carried during their earlier conversation. "And the way you looked when I mentioned ethnic cleansing. That wasn't just moral outrage, Mr. Morrison. That was recognition." Jacob turned to face her, and for a moment, the carefully constructed walls around his memories wavered. The war's been over for more than a decade. Some wars never end. They just move inside. The simplicity of her observation hit him harder than any elaborate psychological analysis could have. Jacob moved to the stove and poured himself another cup of coffee, using the mundane action to buy himself time to decide how much truth he was willing to share. "I was at Andersonville," he said finally, not looking at her. "Confederate prison camp in Georgia. Not as a prisoner, as one of the Union soldiers who liberated it." He heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. Even someone who'd spent most of the war years in Mexico would have heard about Andersonville, about the horrors that had been discovered there when Union forces finally broke through Confederate lines. 13,000 men, Jacob continued, his voice flat and emotionless. That's how many prisoners were crammed into a space designed for maybe 3,000. No shelter, no sanitation, barely any food. The Confederates called it a prison camp. We called it what it was, a death sentence disguised as military policy. He turned back to Elena, and she could see the weight of old memories in his eyes. "You want to know why I live alone in these mountains? Why I don't much care for human company anymore? Because I've seen what people are capable of when they decide that some lives matter less than others. I've seen how easy it is to turn neighbors into enemies, citizens into criminals, human beings into problems that need to be solved." Elena was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the pain in his words. "How many did you save?" "Not enough." The answer came automatically, carved into his soul by years of self-recrimination. "We got there too late for too many of them. Men who'd marched off to war thinking they were fighting for something noble, something worth dying for, and instead they died slowly, forgotten, treated like animals because someone had decided they were enemies rather than fellow human beings." "But you did save some." Jacob shrugged, uncomfortable with anything that sounded like absolution. I followed orders. Did my job. Your job was to liberate a prison camp, but you could have just opened the gates and walked away. Instead, you stayed. You helped the survivors, didn't you? Made sure they got medical care, helped them find their families. It wasn't a question, and Jacob didn't try to deny it. Elena was reading him like an open book, seeing past his attempts at emotional distance to the man he'd tried so hard to leave behind. How could you know that? Because you're doing it again. Elena leaned forward as much as her bindings would allow. Right now with me, you caught a spy, Mr. Morrison. Your duty as a citizen would be to turn me over to the nearest military post and let them handle it. But instead, you're here, listening to my story, wrestling with whether or not to believe me. That's not the behavior of a man who's given up on caring. Jacob sat down heavily, feeling suddenly exhausted. Caring didn't help those men at Andersonville. Caring didn't bring back the ones who died before we got there. No, but it helped the ones who lived. And right now, it might help save thousands of families who don't even know they're in danger. You don't understand. Jacob's voice carried a note of desperation now, as if he was arguing as much with himself as with her. After the war, I tried to go back to normal life. Tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was an aberration, that people were basically good, and that kind of systematic cruelty couldn't happen in peacetime. He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers. But then came the Indian Wars, the reservations, the broken treaties. Same language, same justifications, same willingness to treat human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be respected. And I realized that Andersonville wasn't an aberration. It was a preview. Elena's voice was very quiet when she spoke again. So you ran. I survived. The words came out harsher than Jacob had intended. I found a place where I didn't have to watch good people do terrible things and call it patriotism, where I didn't have to choose between following orders and following my conscience. But you can't run from this one, can you? Elena's eyes were fixed on his face, reading every flicker of emotion. Because this time, it's not happening to strangers in some distant place. This time, it's happening right here, in your mountains, to people who might end up in camps that make Andersonville look like a Sunday picnic. Jacob stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You're asking me to betray my own country. I'm asking you to choose which version of your country you want to serve, the one that promises liberty and justice for all, or the one that writes secret orders for ethnic cleansing. It's not that simple, isn't it? Elena's voice carried a challenge now. At Andersonville, did you ask yourself whether those prisoners might be guilty of something? Did you wonder if maybe they deserved what was happening to them? Or did you just see human beings who needed help? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jacob found himself thinking about those first few minutes after they'd broken through the camp's defenses, the moment when the gates had swung open and he'd gotten his first clear look at what lay beyond. The walking skeletons, the mass graves, the smell of death and despair that had clung to the place like a physical thing. He remembered the face of the first prisoner he'd helped to his feet, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, reduced to skin and bones and hollow eyes that had seen too much. The kid had looked up at him with an expression of such desperate gratitude that Jacob had felt something break open inside his chest. He thanked me, Jacob said quietly, almost to himself. What? The first prisoner I helped. He was just a kid, probably lied about his age to enlist. He grabbed my hand and thanked me over and over, like I was some kind of hero. But all I'd done was open a gate. Elena nodded slowly. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since he'd captured her, he didn't see a spy or an enemy or a problem to be solved. He saw a woman who was trying to open a gate for people who couldn't open it themselves. If what you're telling me is true, he said carefully, if these plans are really being implemented, then you're not the only one gathering intelligence. There must be others. Elena's expression grew cautious. There are, but we're working independently for obvious reasons. If one of us is captured, the others can continue the mission. Exactly. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, turning over possibilities in his mind. These documents you've gathered, How are you planning to get them to Mexico? There's a contact in Denver, someone who can get messages across the border through unofficial channels. Denver's a long way from here, especially with every lawman between here and there, probably looking for a woman matching your description. Elena's jaw tightened. I'll find a way. Not alone you won't. Jacob stood up and moved toward the shelf where he kept his rope. But maybe you don't have to be alone. Elena's eyes widened as she realized what he was doing. Mr. Morrison? Jacob began untying the knots that bound her hands. Call me Jacob. And Elena? Yes. Tell me everything. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to stop what's coming, I need to know exactly what we're up against. As the ropes fell away from her wrists, Elena rubbed the circulation back into her hands and looked up at the man who had just chosen to become her ally rather than her captor. Thank you, she whispered. Jacob nodded grimly. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we're both still alive and those families are safe. Now let's figure out how we're going to get to Denver without getting ourselves killed. Dawn came gray and cold to the mountains, with a thin layer of frost coating the pine needles and a bitter wind that cut through clothing like a knife. Jacob had been awake for hours, preparing for a journey he'd never expected to make with a companion he'd never thought he'd trust. Elena sat by the dying fire, carefully cleaning and checking her camera equipment, the tools of her trade, the instruments that had captured the evidence they needed to deliver to Denver. Her movements were precise, methodical, betraying none of the nervousness Jacob would have expected from someone about to undertake a dangerous cross-country journey with a man who'd been her captor just hours before. We'll need to avoid the main trails, Jacob said, rolling up a detailed map of the territory and sliding it into his saddlebags. Military patrols have been increased since that last Ute uprising, and any woman traveling with a man who doesn't look like her husband is going to draw questions we can't answer. Elena nodded without looking up from her work. How long will it take? The hard way? 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather turns bad. Jacob shouldered his rifle and moved toward the door. And Elena? It's going to be rough country. If you can't keep up, I'll keep up. Her voice carried a quiet confidence that reminded Jacob of soldiers he'd known during the war. People who understood that complaining wouldn't change circumstances, only how you dealt with them. They rode out in the pre-dawn darkness, following a trail that existed more in Jacob's memory than on any surveyor's map. Elena had proven herself to be as capable on horseback as she'd claimed, sitting her mount with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't anything concrete, no glimpse of movement, no sound that didn't belong to the wilderness around them. Just the prickle between his shoulder blades that came from too many years of having enemies who wanted him dead. He'd learned to trust that feeling during the war, and it had kept him alive through situations where more confident men had ended up in shallow graves. By midday, they climbed into country that would challenge even experienced mountain travelers. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through a series of narrow passes and steep switchbacks that seemed designed to break horses' legs and riders' necks. But Jacob knew these mountains like other men, knew their own backyards, and he led them through dangers that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. Tell me about your family, he said during one of their brief rest stops, as much to keep Elena talking as to satisfy his own curiosity. A person's voice could warn you if they were getting too tired to continue, too cold to think clearly, too scared to function effectively. Elena pulled her coat tighter against the wind and took a careful sip from her water canteen. My father came north from Monterey when I was 12. He'd heard that San Antonio needed skilled craftsmen, that there were opportunities for men willing to work hard and learn English. And your mother? She was already there. Her family had been in Texas since before it was Texas, since it was still part of New Spain. Elena's voice carried a note of pride. She used to tell me stories about the old days, when the river was just a river instead of a border that determined whether you belonged or not. Jacob understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. The war had taught him how quickly belonging could become exile, how easily neighbors could become strangers when politics shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Is that why you took this job? For them? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the distant peaks that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Partly, but also because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while bad things are planned in meeting rooms and government offices. Before Jacob could ask what she meant, the sound of horses echoed up from the valley below them. He motioned for silence and moved carefully to the edge of their rocky outcropping, staying low to avoid creating a silhouette against the sky. 3 riders were following their trail, moving with the systematic thoroughness of professionals. Even at this distance, Jacob could see the glint of military insignia on their uniforms. "Cavalry patrol," he whispered, moving back to where Elena waited. "They're tracking us." Elena's face went pale. How could they know? Someone at Fort Davidson must have put together that a missing spy and a missing mountain man might be connected. Jacob was already checking his rifle, making sure he had a full magazine. "Question is, do we run or fight?" "How many?" "3 that I can see, probably more behind them." Elena looked around at the terrain, her tactical mind assessing their options. "If we run, they'll just follow us. And if there are more of them out there, we could be riding into an ambush." Jacob nodded grimly. "My thinking exactly, which means we make our stand here." They had perhaps 10 minutes before the patrol reached their position. Jacob used the time to position their horses behind a cluster of boulders that would provide some protection from gunfire, while Elena found a defensible position among the rocks that gave her a clear field of fire down the trail. "Elena," Jacob said quietly as the sound of approaching hooves grew louder, "if this goes bad, if they get past me, they won't. But if they do, Jacob." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held hope. "They won't get past us." The first soldier appeared around a bend in the trail, carbine held ready but not yet aimed. He was young, probably no more than 25, with the kind of fresh-faced eagerness that reminded Jacob uncomfortably of himself at that age. "You there," the soldier called out. "We're looking for a man named Morrison and a woman traveling with him. We just want to talk." Jacob and Elena exchanged a look. They both knew that wanting to talk was rarely the end goal when military patrols tracked people into the wilderness. "What do you want to talk about?" Jacob called back, keeping his rifle ready but not openly threatening. "Missing persons case. Woman named Sarah Mitchell disappeared from Fort Davidson a few days ago. Her family's worried sick." Elena's jaw tightened at the mention of her alias. The story was plausible enough. Concerned families, missing persons, routine military assistance. But there was something in the soldier's tone that suggested this was anything but routine. "Haven't seen any missing women," Jacob replied. "Just me and my wife heading to Denver to visit her sister. Mind if we come up and verify that? Mind if you don't?" Jacob's voice carried an edge now. "My wife's not feeling well, and we'd prefer not to be disturbed." The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Jacob could almost hear the soldiers below discussing their options, weighing the potential political complications of forcing a confrontation against the possibility that they were letting their quarry slip away. "I'm afraid we'll have to insist," the soldier finally called back. "Military orders." That's when Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including Jacob. She stood up slowly, hands visible but not raised, and called down to the patrol. "Gentlemen, you're looking for a spy, someone who's been stealing military intelligence and passing it to foreign agents." Jacob's heart nearly stopped. What was she doing? "That's right, ma'am. You know anything about that?" Elena's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "I know that the woman you're looking for is someone who discovered that her own government was planning to betray the trust of thousands of loyal American citizens. Someone who couldn't stand by and watch while families were torn apart in the name of political expediency." The soldiers below exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the response they'd been expecting. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down here so we can sort this out properly." "I don't think so." Elena's voice was steady, calm, carrying the authority of someone who'd made peace with whatever consequences might come. "Because you see, gentlemen, I'm not just a spy. I'm also a witness. And the documents I've gathered, the evidence I've collected, it's already been copied and sent to people who know how to use it." Jacob realized what she was doing. She was buying them time, creating confusion, making the soldiers think twice about what they might be walking into. "So here's what's going to happen," Elena continued. "You're going to turn around and ride back to Fort Davidson. You're going to report that you found no trace of Sarah Mitchell or anyone matching her description. And you're going to forget that this conversation ever happened. Ma'am, we can't. Or, Elena's voice cut through the soldier's protest like a blade, you can try to take us in. But I promise you, if you do, the documents I've collected will be in the hands of newspaper editors from Denver to Washington by the end of the week. And everyone will learn exactly what kind of orders your commanding officers have been writing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sound of horses could be heard moving away down the trail. Elena sank back down behind the rocks, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. That, Jacob said quietly, was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. Elena looked at him with a tired smile. Maybe both. As they prepared to continue their journey, Jacob found himself looking at his traveling companion with new respect. She'd just faced down 3 armed soldiers with nothing but words and conviction, and she'd done it to protect not just their mission, but him as well. Elena? Yes? Remind me never to play poker with you. Her laugh echoed off the mountainsides as they rode deeper into the wilderness, carrying their dangerous secrets toward Denver and whatever waited for them there. 4 days of hard riding through mountain passes and hidden trails had brought them to the outskirts of Denver, just as the sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains. The city sprawled before them like a promise of civilization after their wilderness ordeal, gas lamps beginning to flicker to life in windows and street corners, the distant sound of piano music drifting from saloons and hotels. But Jacob felt no relief at the sight. If anything, the knot of tension in his stomach had only grown tighter as they'd gotten closer to their destination, because Denver meant the end of their journey together, and he wasn't ready for that ending. Elena sat her horse beside him, studying the city below with the focused intensity of someone planning a military operation, which Jacob supposed was exactly what she was doing. The contact is at the Larimer Hotel, she said quietly. Room 237. A man named Carlos Medina. He owns a freight company that runs wagons between here and Santa Fe. Jacob nodded, though part of him wanted to suggest they turn around and ride back into the mountains, back to the simple clarity of survival that didn't require choosing between duty and desire. Elena, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the thoughts that had been building in his mind for the past 4 days. She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her face was soft with an expression he'd never seen before. Not the careful composure of a spy or the desperate determination of someone fighting for her family, but something more personal, more vulnerable. I know, she said quietly. You know what? What you're thinking, what you're feeling. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'm feeling it too. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Jacob had told himself that what he felt for Elena was just the natural result of shared danger, the artificial intimacy that came from relying on each other for survival. But looking at her now, seeing the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes, he knew it was something deeper than that. This is complicated, he said finally. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. You're an American citizen. I'm a Mexican spy. You could be hanged for treason just for helping me this far. And you could be shot as an enemy agent just for being here. So what do we do? It was the question Jacob had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Because he knew what the right answer was supposed to be: deliver the documents, complete the mission, go their separate ways before anyone else got hurt. But the right answer felt like tearing out part of his soul. We finished what we started, he said, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Elena nodded slowly, and Jacob could see her rebuilding the walls around her heart, preparing herself for what came next. The documents need to reach Mexico City within the week if they're going to do any good. Carlos has connections, ways of getting messages across the border without going through official channels. And after that, I disappear. New identity, new mission, new life. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jacob could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. It's what I do, Jacob. It's who I am. Is it? Or is it just who you've had to become? The question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, the spy's mask slipped, and Jacob caught a glimpse of the woman underneath. someone who was as tired of running as he was, someone who wanted nothing more than to stop looking over her shoulder and wondering if each day would be her last. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "This is the only life I know how to live." "What if it wasn't? What if you had a choice?" Elena's laugh was bitter now. "Choice? Jacob, my parents are still in San Antonio. My younger brother works as a translator for the territorial government, the same government that's planning to round up his friends and neighbors. I don't have the luxury of choice." "Everyone has a choice." "Really? Then what's yours?" Elena's eyes blazed with sudden anger. "You could ride away right now. Go back to your mountain cabin, your simple life, your splendid isolation. Pretend none of this ever happened. Pretend you never learned about the Southwestern Pacification Initiative, never saw the evidence, never met me. What's stopping you?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. What was stopping him? Not duty. He owed nothing to Mexico or to Elena's cause. Not patriotism. If anything, what he was doing went against the interests of his own country. Not even justice, really, because there were injustices everywhere, and he'd managed to ignore most of them for years. "You," he said finally, "you're what's stopping me." Elena's anger seemed to drain away as quickly as it had come. "Jacob, I know it's crazy. I know it doesn't make sense. We've known each other for less than a week, and half of that time you were my prisoner." Jacob turned in his saddle to face her fully. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped being a job and started being someone I care about. Someone I can't just walk away from. Even if caring about me could get you killed, even then." Elena closed her eyes and Jacob could see her struggling with emotions she'd probably trained herself not to feel. When she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. "Do you know what I was thinking about these past 4 days? While we were riding through those mountain passes, while we were running from that patrol, while we were sharing rations around campfires?" Elena's voice was thick with emotion now. "I was thinking about what it would be like to wake up in the same place every morning, to have conversations with someone who knew my real name, to live a life where I didn't have to remember which lies I'd told to which people. You could have that. No, I couldn't, because even if I wanted to abandon my mission, abandon my family, abandon everything I've worked for, which I don't, there would always be someone looking for me. Someone who knew what I'd done, what I'd stolen, what I'd betrayed. I'd never be safe, Jacob, and neither would you." Jacob knew she was right, knew that the logical thing was to complete their mission and go their separate ways. But logic had never been his strong suit, especially when it came to people he cared about. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Elena blinked. "What?" "After you deliver the documents, after your contact gets them safely to Mexico City, come with me. We'll go somewhere they can't find us. Montana Territory maybe, or the Oregon coast. Somewhere we can disappear." "Jacob, you're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years." Jacob reached out and took her hand, and she didn't pull away. "Elena, I've spent the last decade running from the idea that I might matter to someone, that someone might matter to me. I told myself it was easier to be alone, safer to care about nothing and no one. But these past few days, with you, they've reminded me what it feels like to be alive." Elena's tears were flowing freely now. "And what about your country? Your duty?" "My duty is to do what's right, not what's convenient for politicians and generals." Jacob's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd finally found his moral center again. "If preventing ethnic cleansing makes me a traitor, then I'll be a traitor with a clear conscience. They'll never stop hunting us. Then we'll keep running, together." Elena was quiet for a long time, staring down at their joined hands as if they held the answer to every question she'd ever asked herself. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear despite the tears. "Ask me again," she said softly. "After I deliver the documents. After I know my family and those thousands of other families have a chance to prepare for what's coming. Ask me then, and I'll give you an answer." Jacob nodded, though his heart was already breaking at the uncertainty in her voice. "And if your answer is no?" Elena leaned over and kissed him, soft and desperate, and full of all the words they hadn't said. When she pulled back, her voice was barely a whisper. "Then we'll have tonight." As they rode down into Denver, toward the Larimer Hotel and Carlos Medina, in the next chapter of a mission that had become something neither of them had expected, Jacob found himself holding on to that promise like a lifeline. One night might not be enough, but it was more than he'd dared to hope for just a week ago. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the beginning of something that could last longer than either of them had any right to dream. The Larimer Hotel sat on the corner of 15th and Lawrence like a fortress of respectability in the heart of Denver's bustling downtown district. Gas lamps flickered in the windows, casting warm golden light onto the muddy streets where freight wagons and carriages jostled for position among the evening foot traffic. Jacob tied their horses to the hitching post outside, his eyes automatically scanning the street for anything that looked out of place. After 4 days of constantly watching their backs, paranoia had become second nature. But the crowd seemed normal enough. Miners fresh from the mountains with gold dust in their pockets, businessmen in wool coats discussing railroad investments, working girls in colorful dresses heading to their evening shifts at the saloons. "Room 237, Elena murmured as they climbed the hotel's carpeted stairs. She'd transformed herself again during their brief stop at a dry goods store, trading her trail-worn clothes for a respectable traveling dress, and arranging her hair in a style that would help her blend in with Denver's more refined visitors. But Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she moved that spoke of someone prepared for violence at any moment. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit and smelled of tobacco smoke and cheap perfume. Jacob knocked twice on the door of room 237, paused, then knocked 3 times, the pattern Elena had described during their journey. The man who opened the door was nothing like what Jacob had expected. Carlos Medina was small and neat, with silver-streaked hair and the soft hands of someone who'd spent more time with ledger books than freight wagons. But his eyes were sharp and alert, and Jacob noticed the way his coat hung slightly heavy on one side, the weight of a concealed weapon. "Señorita Vasquez," Medina said in accented English, stepping aside to let them enter. "I was beginning to worry." "We ran into some complications," Elena replied, switching to Spanish for a rapid exchange that Jacob couldn't follow but understood from context. Questions about pursuit, assurances about the document's safety, arrangements for the next stage of their journey. The hotel room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the street below. Medina gestured for them to sit while he moved to a travel trunk in the corner and began pulling out papers and writing materials. "The information you've gathered," he said, returning to English for Jacob's benefit, "it has already proven invaluable. My contacts in Mexico City have been able to verify much of what you discovered and are taking steps to prepare our people." Elena reached into her satchel and withdrew the leather portfolio containing the photographs and documents they'd risked their lives to obtain. "How long before this reaches the capital?" 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather in the passes is bad." Medina accepted the portfolio with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. "But Elena, there is something else. Something you need to know before you make your final decisions." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the window. Elena's face had gone pale, and her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "What is it?" she asked. Medina opened his own portfolio and withdrew a telegram, yellow with age and worn from handling. "This arrived 2 days ago from San Antonio. It concerns your family." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Are they? They are alive, but—" Medina hesitated, clearly struggling with how to deliver whatever news he carried. "There was a raid 3 nights ago, territorial militia, acting on orders from the governor's office. They arrested 47 Mexican nationals on charges of sedition and conspiracy." "My parents? Your father was taken. Your mother and brother managed to escape, but they are in hiding now, afraid to return to their home." Medina's voice was gentle but inexorable. "Elena, the situation has changed. The timeline has accelerated. What we thought would happen over months is happening over weeks." Elena doubled over as if she'd been physically struck, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a cry of anguish. Jacob moved instinctively to comfort her, placing a hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off. "I have to go back," she said, her voice thick with tears and determination. "I have to help them." "Elena, no." Medina shook his head firmly. "That is exactly what they want you to do. Your family's arrest was not random. It was bait. They know you are here, know you have been gathering intelligence. They are counting on your emotional response to draw you into a trap." "I don't care." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the gaslit street below. "Those are my parents, my brother. I can't just abandon them." "You cannot help them if you are dead or captured," Medina replied reasonably. "And there are thousands of other families who need the information you have gathered. Would you sacrifice them all for the sake of 3 people, even if those people are your own blood?" It was the classic spy's dilemma. Personal loyalty versus the greater good. Individual love versus collective responsibility. Jacob had seen it during the war, had watched good men make impossible choices that haunted them for the rest of their lives. "There might be another way," Jacob said quietly. Both Elena and Medina turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. "I'm listening," Elena said. Jacob moved to the window beside her, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities. "Medina, you said your freight company runs wagons between here and Santa Fe. What's your usual cargo?" "Supplies mostly. Tools, fabric, manufactured goods from the eastern factories. Sometimes livestock." "And your drivers? Are they all your people?" Medina's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are thinking of something specific, Senor Morrison. I'm thinking that a freight wagon heading south might be able to carry more than just commercial cargo, and that sometimes the best way to avoid military attention is to hide in plain sight." Elena grabbed Jacob's arm. "You're talking about a rescue mission. I'm talking about finishing what we started." Jacob looked at both of them, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who'd finally found his purpose. "We deliver the documents to Mexico City as planned, but we do it by way of San Antonio. We extract Elena's family and take them south with us." "That is insane," Medina said flatly. "The risks are manageable if we're smart about it." Jacob was warming to the idea now, seeing possibilities where others saw only obstacles. "Elena knows the territory around San Antonio better than any of us. I know how to move people without being detected, and you, Medina, have the resources and connections to make it work. And if we are caught, then we're caught trying to do the right thing instead of hiding in hotel rooms while innocent people suffer." Elena was staring at Jacob with an expression he'd never seen before, hope mixed with amazement, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "You would do that?" she asked softly. "Risk your life for people you've never met?" "I'd do it for you," Jacob replied simply, "and maybe that's the same thing." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of carriages rattling past on the street below. Finally, Medina sighed and began rolling up his maps. "Very well," he said, "but we do this my way, with my people, following my plan. And if at any point I decide the risks have become unacceptable, we abort the mission and proceed to Mexico City without the detour." Elena threw her arms around Jacob's neck, holding him tight enough that he could feel her heart beating against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me hope when I thought I had none left." 3 days later, they were in position outside San Antonio. Medina's freight wagon was loaded with legitimate cargo, bolts of cloth, barrels of flour, crates of tools, but hidden beneath the floorboards was a compartment large enough to conceal 3 people for the journey south. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Elena would infiltrate the territorial jail where her father was being held, create a distraction that would allow Jacob to extract the prisoner, while Medina positioned the wagon for a quick escape. "Remember," Medina said as they made their final preparations, "you have 15 minutes from the moment Elena enters the building. Any longer, and the risks become unacceptable." Elena checked her pistol one last time and tucked it into her dress. She transformed herself again, this time into a concerned citizen coming to inquire about a missing relative. The kind of person who wouldn't draw suspicion from jail guards accustomed to dealing with worried families. "What if he's not there?" she asked. "What if they've already moved him?" Then we abort and stick to the original plan, Jacob said firmly. Elena promised me, if this goes wrong, if we get separated, you get to that wagon and you go to Mexico City. Don't try to be a hero. Elena smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman Jacob had fallen in love with during their mountain journey. Brave and beautiful, and absolutely determined to see justice done. I promise, she said, as long as you promise me something in return. What's that? Promise me that when this is over, when we're safely across the border, and my family is free, you'll ask me that question again. Jacob knew exactly what question she meant. And what will your answer be? Elena rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of all the tomorrows they might have together. Ask me and find out, she whispered. 2 hours later, they were racing through the Texas night with Elena's father, unconscious but alive in the hidden compartment of Medina's wagon, her mother and brother riding beside the driver with forged papers identifying them as legitimate passengers. Behind them, the lights of San Antonio flickered like distant stars, and ahead lay the promise of a new life in a place where being Mexican wasn't a crime, and love could triumph over the petty hatreds of politicians and generals. Elena sat pressed against Jacob's side, her head on his shoulder, finally allowing herself to believe that they'd actually succeeded. Her family was safe. The documents were en route to Mexico City, and the man she loved had proven himself willing to risk everything for her happiness. Jacob, she murmured as the wagon wheels carried them south toward freedom. Yeah, ask me. Jacob smiled in the darkness, holding her close as the desert wind carried the scent of sage and new possibilities. Elena Vasquez, he said quietly, will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, and sealed her answer with a kiss that tasted like hope and justice, and the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its approval to the star-filled sky. And so, across the vast expanse of the American Southwest, another tale drifts away with the desert wind, carrying with it the echoes of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that form when two souls find each other in the wilderness. Elena Vasquez and Jacob Morrison's story didn't end with that starlit proposal in Carlos Medina's freight wagon. Historical records show that they settled in a small village outside Guadalajara, where Jacob used his mountain survival skills to help establish one of Mexico's first wilderness guide services, while Elena became a teacher, this time using her real name and sharing real stories with children who hung on every word of her adventures. The documents Elena risked her life to obtain reached the right hands just in time. The Southwestern Pacification Initiative was exposed in newspapers from Denver to Mexico City, creating such a public outcry that the plans were quietly shelved by embarrassed politicians who suddenly found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about American values and constitutional promises. Elena's father, rescued from that territorial jail in San Antonio, lived another 23 years and never tired of telling anyone who would listen about the night a mountain man and a spy saved his family from a government that had forgotten its own founding principles. Her mother continued teaching children in both English and Spanish, and her brother eventually became a successful diplomat, working to build bridges between the two nations his sister had served with such dedication. But perhaps the most remarkable part of their story is what it tells us about the choices we make when everything we believe in is put to the test. Jacob Morrison could have turned Elena into the authorities and returned to his solitary mountain cabin, convinced that individual safety was more important than collective justice. Elena could have completed her mission and disappeared into the shadows, choosing duty over the dangerous vulnerability of love. Instead, they chose each other. They chose to believe that sometimes the most radical act of patriotism is standing up to your own government when it betrays the values it claims to represent. They chose to trust that love built on shared principles and mutual respect could survive the storms that destroy relationships based on less solid foundations. Their story reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just about gunfights and gold rushes. It was about people from different worlds learning to see past their fears and prejudices to find common ground. It was about individuals making moral choices that rippled across generations, shaping the kind of society their children and grandchildren would inherit. In our own time, when the news seems full of division and hatred, when politicians use fear to turn neighbors against neighbors, Elena and Jacob's story offers us something precious, proof that courage and compassion can triumph over suspicion and selfishness, that love really can bridge the divides that seem to separate us. Because at its heart, this isn't just a story about spies and mountain men, about government conspiracies and daring rescues. It's a story about what happens when we choose to see the humanity in people who look different from us, speak different languages, worship different gods, or call different places home. It's about the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, our differences make us stronger rather than weaker. So what do you think? In Elena's position, would you have risked everything for people you'd never met? In Jacob's place, would you have chosen love over the safety of isolation? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to principles? Between following orders and following your conscience? We want to hear your thoughts, your own stories of moral courage, your reflections on what it means to be loyal to the best versions of our countries rather than the worst. Drop your comments below and let's continue this conversation, because these aren't just historical questions, they're challenges every generation faces in its own way. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of ordinary people to change the course of history through extraordinary moral courage, then smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear Elena and Jacob's message of hope. Because stories like these remind us that heroes aren't born. They're made in moments when good people decide that remaining silent is no longer an option. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you new tales of courage, love, and the indomitable human spirit that built the American frontier. From outlaw redemptions to unlikely romances, from battles against corruption to fights for justice, we're here to remind you that the Wild West was wild precisely because it was full of people brave enough to write their own rules and bold enough to fight for what they believed in. Until next time, keep riding toward justice, keep fighting for what's right, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most dangerous choices. This is Wild West Stories, where legends live on and heroes never die.